This is FRM Part II, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, and the chapter on building the UK financial sector's operational resilience. I was particularly interested in reading this chapter because I know very little about the UK financial sector's operational resilience. I learned a bunch of new information and I hope I can share that with you. But before we get into the learning objectives, I would like to point out that this was kind of a joint effort among the Prudential Regulation Authority and the Financial Conduct Authority and the Bank of England. The only experience I have with the Bank of England is I know the governor of the Bank of England was the dude who gave James Bond that bar of gold back in the great Goldfinger movie way back in the early 60s. But I do know that the PRA and the FCA have two different kind of functions, and so it's interesting from my perspective that these three organizations who are interested in the financial industry in the UK got together and wrote this discussion paper. 4 learning objectives, and what we're going to do in this particular chapter is kind of take a step back and remind ourselves of some of the elements that we talked about a few chapters ago, just about general operational risk. We're going to take a step back away from the cyber threats that we've talked about in the previous few chapters. So describe operational resilience, threats and challenges, recommended principles, consequences, and then impact tolerance will be our last slide or two. This is a relatively short chapter, and we have a relatively short slide deck, so this shouldn't take us too long to get through. Let's start with a good definition: operational resilience. Ability of an organization to continue to provide business services in the face of adverse operational events. Of course, by anticipating, preventing, recovering, and adapting. Here's this great block point. Hopefully you remember this from just our previous chapter. Tech and data, resources, third parties must work in unison to drive this service delivery. So what are we trying to do? Anticipate, prevent, and adapt. This was a key element of the learning objectives in one of those previous chapters. You might remember that on that previous slide deck, I had the word anticipate or anticipation bolded in red. And that's so critical, not just for cyber threats, but also for operational risk in general. There's a good quote there: desperately trying to shut the stable door when the horse has already bolted. My father had an interesting comment that's similar to that I won't share with you now. How about cornerstones of operational resilience? This, I think, is an important learning objective. All right, so notice that we've got the circles up there. So governance, organization, focus, measurement, integration, and preparedness. All right, so governance, clear roles and responsibilities. And this, of course, has to come from the board of directors and senior leadership. A concrete risk appetite statement. Boy, this is something that we've seen multiple times before. We need to know, and we take our direction from the board of directors, what is our appetite for risk, and then how do we define risk, and then inside of that policy, we need to make sure that we're transparent and that we report all of the variables inside of that risk appetite statement. An organizational focus. How about an identification of the critical business components that simply cannot fail? Think of these as the core parts of the business. You know, in management classes and in corporate finance classes, we always teach students about, the core competencies. What does the organization do best? What's the best thing that we do that we cannot allow to fail? And of course, the thing that we best do, whether it's wealth management or certificates of deposit, if that's the best that we can do, then we build our model based on the success of that core competency. The organizational focus also should have a detailed assessment of the economic impact of a disruption. I mean, I like this. This is all part of the anticipation. We need to say something like, look, if this thing happens, whatever that event is, if a cyber threat comes in and steals 1,000 pieces of our client's information, what's the impact of that disruption? So then we have a clear idea of what the consequences are, and then we can remind all of the employees of the importance of risk culture and being aware of risk and how important this is for us. Measurement, you guys know that I'm big on quantification in almost all of our recorded videos. Quantify the effects of a failure and a disruption, and then list some tolerances for business disruption. We'll talk about this in the last couple of slides. If we have a cyber event or a third-party failure that affects 5 of our clients, and our 5 clients each have 5,000 euros or $5,000 as part of their investment strategy or borrowing or lending, that's probably not going to end up in a business disruption. But, if it's a huge thing, then we need to worry about it. Now, we have spoken of integration before, right? We've got these business lines or these business units. Remember, we called these silos. So how are they linked in terms of sharing of assets and sharing of resources? And then, of course, how are they integrated in terms of risk, whether it's value risk, whether it's operational risk, whether it's cyber risk? And then finally, preparedness, right? How are we going to handle this? Of course, we need to make certain that we're aware of all the threats out there and what happens if we have this particular scenario. Are those plans adaptable to the dynamics of all of those threats and risks? Here's a really good slide. I like this one a lot. So, threats and challenges to operational resilience. And if you take a step back and for just a second and kind of think of the big picture. Remember, I'm kind of a big picture dude. What are these threats and challenges to operational resilience? What are these things that are coming into our organization that are going to threaten our core competency? All right, so it can come from competition, right? Fast-paced innovation. We've got technology. Do the institutions have time to identify weakness and interconnections, right? So there's always innovation that's being driven from all sorts of places, sometimes inside of our organization, sometimes outside of the organization. How about outdated technology, right? We're all guilty of this. I know I am. At my school, we used to use Moodle to deliver our class structure to the students. Last summer we changed to Canvas. So, it took me 100 years to learn Moodle. Now it's going to take me another 100 years to learn Canvas, but I've been told that this is better for our students. I don't know if it is or not. I'll kind of find out, but I want to stick with something that I know. All right, so what does that tell you there in that column? We've managed to master and understand, but maybe they don't integrate with newer technologies. Maybe they have more of a cost. Maybe there are more marginal costs that may appear today or tomorrow. Technical innovation, financial technology known as fintech, artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies and crypto assets. There's some idea out there that these have destabilized the financial system. I have a cousin who was paid in some online transaction with Bitcoin. And it's been fascinating to listen to him talk about his Bitcoin investment. I mean, it was a relatively small amount. I don't know, it was $50 or something. And so some days he comes to me and says, hey, it's worth $12 million. And some days he comes to me and says, it's worth 12 cents. So it's interesting to see from a personal standpoint from my cousin, but also how this can affect the larger global financial system as well. Cyber threats, this was just a previous chapter. We've got all of these threats that are coming in. We're vulnerable. Are we not vulnerable? Remember what we said, anticipate and be able to detect and then respond and then recover. And then, of course, that final column out there, these system complexities. Of course, we've got reputational risk and concentration risk, but we have third-party risk, we have cross-border risk, we have interconnected transactions, and so look at the bottom bolded there. Political interference and bureaucracy makes these systems complex. So we need a strategy, right? Remember, we've got this big umbrella here. So our board of directors and our senior leaders have to develop this business strategy to be able to identify all of these threats and then manage them. Because of course, we're faced with these every day. Maybe not every day, but maybe every hour, right? If we're only worried about these things on a daily basis, we're probably behind. Two quick examples. We have Raphael's Bank. Look at the bottom block point there. 3,367 customers could not use their cards on December 24th in 2015. Look at the Nokia's, this phone technology. So they showed resistance and they relied on some flawed operating system, and it was taken over then. So you have these operational resiliencies examples that show that if we're not on top of this, if we're not managing this operational risk in its proper manner, that sooner or later there's something that's going to be disruptive. And it might be so disruptive that our business ceases to exist. How about some recommended principles for maintaining a strong operational resilience? All right, governance, right? This comes from the board. Risk management, here's the strategy that we're implementing from emerging risks to outsourcing, third-party use of technology. And then, of course, we need internal controls. We need an internal audit, but we also need some system of internal controls that identifies things like, thresholds for risk, maybe system access, authorization. Where I teach, I get an email, I think it's every month, saying, hey, Jim, it's been 10 years since you've changed your password. Why don't you go ahead and change it today? Outsourcing, of course, this is extremely important. Well understood by the board. Yeah, communication. With communication, I always think of transparency, right? Whatever we're trying to communicate, we need to make sure we have all of the information and the data, and then we need to communicate into those relevant parties. I like this learning objective here, improving operational resilience. Now, let me just remind you that this is essentially what I've been telling you guys about from the very beginning of these videos. Identify the risks, manage the risks, and then, identify the risk, quantify the risk, and then manage the risk. Whoops, didn't mean to skip ahead. So let's go ahead and look at some of the sub-elements of my three. So identify, that's an obvious notion, right? To map the processes and systems. So this is all part of identification. So we identify the risk, and then as part of identifying it, we map it. And you can map it any which way you want. You can map it this way, you can map it that way. I've done a bunch of mapping for our curriculum where I teach, and whatever I map, my dean or my boss, they always says, Jim, why don't you think of it this way? So there's all different sorts of ways to map, but then but you got to put it in a system so that everybody can understand it. So we identify the risks, then we quantify the risks. All right, so here's the assessing and the testing, how the failure of a single system may impact the business service, and then see if it meets certain tolerance levels. So that's kind of like measuring in there. And then we've got to manage. So we have all this information, and then we have to invest in the appropriate system so we can manage the risk, and then we can communicate timely information to all the key stakeholders. I always think of stakeholders as the bondholders and the shareholders and the employees, but then stakeholders are on both sides of the supply chain. And of course, inside of financial services industry, this includes regulators and maybe some government lawmakers. How about potential consequences of business interruptions? I tell you guys regularly that I read the Wall Street Journal all the time, and this is really just a summary of what you read there on a daily basis. Business disruptions, access checking accounts, execute fund transfers, acquire credit, take up insurance contracts, liquidate, trading platforms, market data. And these are just a series of possible business disruptions. Now, of course, the idea is that if there is a substantial business disruption in one financial institution, that this will overflow into other financial institutions. Look at that first block point, right? Dependent on operational resilience of other interconnected market participants. Cause severe instability or collapse because of this high level of interconnectedness. So that's the one thing that we need to worry about in the financial institution industry is this interconnectedness. For example, if we have a systematically important bank, who gets to determine which bank is systematically important and which bank is not? But some kind of a cyber incident can overflow. Remember, we called that contagion a few recorded videos ago. How about that last learning objective about impact tolerance? And I thought this was about the coolest part of this chapter, at least from my perspective. It refers to a maximum tolerable level of disruption. Let's go back to my earlier example. If we affect 5 customers, is that the maximum, or should it be 50, or should it be 500, or should it be a dollar amount, or should it be volume? So look at the measurable metrics: number of customers, volume, tolerable duration, 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 3 hours. I will tell you about this impact tolerance that I've experienced on a personal level just recently. One of my sons lost his wallet, and we didn't think it was stolen. We just couldn't find it. And so I was able to go into my credit card's webpage, and I was able to lock my credit card. Now, of course, it's my credit card, but it's his credit card, and my daughter has a credit card. So we had to lock all 3 of those together. But what that did was that cut down on the cyber threat. Of course, if they have his number, then they have my number and they have my daughter's number. And so that kind of a strategy and that implementation allowed me to control this from the financial institution's perspective. And so that limits their potential losses, and it limits my losses. It makes me feel comfortable. I mean, I slept really well overnight. Of course, my son found his wallet the next morning. How about best practices here? We've done lots and lots of best practices, so that this is a great exam question. So set impact tolerances at least annually. And I was a little surprised that was emphasized in the chapter. I'm never very comfortable when someone says something is, annually or semi-annually or 10,000 or 5,000 or whatever that number is. And so I'm always ready to put together a sentence that says set impact tolerances, as needed. But of course, as annually, that's at least annually, that's probably a good exam answer. Should not set their tolerances at excessively high levels, right? Okay, if we have 1 million customers affected, then that's the maximum tolerable level. That doesn't make any sense. An impact tolerance should relate to a single disruption, since the goal is to identify how quickly a firm, remember that, a single disruption, doesn't have to be a series of disruptions. It can be just one customer or it could be just one trade, but that single disruption then could lead to a host of other disruptions. Now, benefits for establishing this impact tolerance, right? Prioritize their investments. And this one goes all the way back to putting together a investment policy statement for a client in the whole wealth management business line, right? You asked your client to identify and set some goals, and you put an attachment of a priority, like a percentile, like, you need this 100%, or, you could deal with this one at 50%. So what this does is allows the financial institution to prioritize their investments and say something like, 5 might be tolerable here, but 10 might be tolerable over there. Of course, it provides scope, and it serves as a focal point for supervisory engagement. I like that one because then that leads to a discussion between the supervisor and the team. And when the team says, hey, you know what, we're getting near this high impact, at noon on Thursdays or whatever that scenario might be. And then the team and the supervisor can get together and say, okay, let's go back and let's figure out if we're doing it the right way. And that takes us through these learning objectives here. Once again, only 4 of them, but I always like best practices questions. So identify, and then measure, and then best practices. I think those are best exam questions.